Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kambiz Ranawati, board member for ColumbiaDC and a graduate of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. First, I would like to thank our partners for this event, Columbia University Clubs of New York and New Jersey, and their members for being with us this evening. We are very privileged to have Jeffrey Fagan, Isidor and Seville Sulzbacher Professor of Law at Columbia Law School, also founding director of the Center for Violence Research and Prevention at Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia, to talk about guns and share current perspectives on the Second Amendment and American lives. In addition to his affiliation with Columbia, Professor Fagan is also a senior research scholar at Yale Law School. He served on the Committee on the Law and Justice of the National Academy of Science from 2000 and 2006. He was a member of the 2004 National Research Council panel that examined policing in the US and the 2010 NRC workshop on understanding crime trends. He was an expert consultant to the US Department of Justice in his 2015 investigation of the Ferguson Police Department in Missouri. He was the lead expert witness for plaintiffs in the 2013 civil rights trial on the New York City's stop and frisk policy, and an expert witness before the Constitutional Court of Indonesia on capital punishment. In fact, he was an expert witness on capital punishment to the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights from 2010 to 2016. He is also a fellow of the American Society of Criminology. Without further ado, Professor Fagan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I have to say in advance, two things. One, I'm in a house without air conditioning, and so I'm a little dizzy. It's very warm here. Second, though, this is an enormous field to cover, even in the generous allotment of time that I have to talk to you. So forgive me a little bit for trying to capture the highlights and give you at least a grounding in what I think are the essential questions, and in particular, leading up to and including the decision in Bruin versus the New York State Shooting Association, which was just handed down by the Supreme Court at the end of June, and which I think, given everything we understand about the dynamics of gun violence, will have profound effects on cities and on people living in those cities, as well as in rural areas. So with that in mind, let me begin. I'm going to share the screen. Can I share the screen, Ramiz?
Yes, you're the host.
Okay, sorry, my even after all these years, I'm really pretty unskilled at Zoom. Okay, so here we are. Are you all seeing the title screen, or are you seeing some other screen?
We see both.
Sorry?
We see both of them.
Okay. Well, I think it'll work anyway, so we'll just proceed. Let me start with a story. During in the late 1990s, the mid to late 1990s, I was the principal investigator of a research project where we interviewed young men who were involved in gun violence in different neighborhoods of New York City. And this was a period of time which New York was just coming off the historical peak homicide rate in 1993. We got into the field with our interviewers in 1996 and concluded, and it took us roughly 4 years to get all the data and then get it published. We interviewed 450 some odd young men in 3 different neighborhoods in the city. We asked them in these interviews to describe to us different incidents when they had a gun and either could shoot or didn't shoot, and when they carried a gun and when they didn't carry a gun. And we asked them to reflect on those incidents and reconstruct those incidents in their minds so we could understand their decision making. And we learned a lot. The young men recounted to us over 750 distinct episodes of violence, and also situations where they weren't violent. And from the data, we had all these transcripts. This was a little bit before people were using machine learning and AI to discern meaning out of text. So we had to do it the old-fashioned way. But we were able to discern that from their reports that they were describing to us how functional violence was. It helped them gain status. It helped them ward off enemies. It helped them get dates with attractive young women. It helped them get material items, clothing in particular. But the most important thing was that it let other people in the neighborhood know that they were not to be messed with. And so we discerned a status hierarchy, and the guns helped place people on that status hierarchy towards the top. But being high on the status hierarchy actually invited some aggression against you, because others in the neighborhood would see you as somebody to be knocked off. And so they could assume your position in the status hierarchy. And so this was a cycle, and it was somewhat of a vicious cycle. We found that the way that they described the incidents and the decision-making was very much, it followed a kind of script from the beginning of the episode through the escalation, through the decision-making point when they had to decide whether to pull the gun and use the gun or not, and so on. What was shocking to us is that the descriptions that they gave, these were young men from 3 different neighborhoods, the South Bronx, Central Harlem, and Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn. And they all told us the same story. They all told us the same scripts. They had no reason to know one another. They were young men. They were between 18 and 21. They had no reason to have consulted with others. These were standard scripts. And we thought that the fact that it was scripted was remarkable, because this is a mechanism, a way for them to learn, kind of like a cultural software about how they could deal with the menace of guns in their neighborhoods. One thing they made clear to us was that the difference between a shooting episode and a non-shooting episode was simply the presence of the gun. When guns are present, everything changes. All of the decision-making that they went through in deciding whether to attack or not attack an enemy in their neighborhood was determined by whether or not they had a gun, and whether or not, and most important, they assumed that the other person had a gun. And we listened to these stories and we talked about it, and with my interviewers, who were people from the neighborhoods, and we thought that they were describing to us essentially a contagious epidemic. That when they came into contact with another person, the fear and the strategizing and the presence of the gun signaled something to that other person, and then they were engaged in this process. So it seemed to us that we had something along the lines of a mechanism of violence contagion. And this image to the right was based on research done by a former student, Andrew Papachristos, and his colleagues, where they charted people who were victims of gun violence and asked whether or not they knew one another. And the red sections are the places where each person was a dot, and where the dots were connected by people who knew one another, either through violence or through their presence at the same neighborhoods. So you can see that roughly about maybe over a third, close to 40% of the people in this city, in Chicago at this time, were involved in these networks of violence. And these were not networks of street fights, these were networks of gun violence. So we took lessons from this, and I think the lessons have endured for us in thinking about the way that violence takes place. And in particular, the kind of violence that we're seeing now in the big uptake in violence in the major cities. So set that aside, keep that in the back of your minds, and then let's talk a little bit more about guns and violence. Now, we're at a moment. This is a very dangerous moment. It's a very poignant moment. It's a very emotional moment. You can see the way I listed out the ways that I think about the moment. Law and the interpretation of statutes matter, because this is part of the contest that took place in Bruin. We are not at all certain about the causes of gun violence. Some people think it's mental health. Some people think it's bad families. Some people think it's just social structure and poverty. Some people think it's just simply the presence of the gun. And I tip towards the latter, because that was the lesson that we took away from our study in 3 neighborhoods in New York. But it's a moment when we're scared. We're scared sometimes to leave our houses. We're scared for our own safety. We don't really know to whom to call for help. Calling the police is not always the solution. And it's important to remember that guns are used instrumentally in suicide as well. And so some of us may actually internalize this fear, compounded by the pandemic that we've just lived through and are still living through. And it may lead us to hurt ourselves because we suffer from mental health problems as well. So just bear that in mind. We're in an incredibly charged, poignant, dangerous, and emotional moment, which clouds the way that we think and the decisions that we make. And so we're all on edge. So with that, keep that in mind as we talk. So here's what I want to go through. There's evidence on guns and deaths, gun violence and gun fatalities, both homicide and suicide. I want to talk about homicides over time, because over time, these things come and go. You'll see some evidence of 3 different and specific cycles of gun homicide and gun violence over the past 50 to 60 years. And we're now in a 4th. And the 4th may be different because of the pandemic, or it may not be. And I'll give you some thoughts that I have about that. Then I want to talk about what happened to gun violence in the pandemic. And I think we all know that violence rates have spiked up. And I'll show you some data that suggests just how quickly they have spiked up. We're in a moment now, given the Bruen decision in the Supreme Court, and all of the appellate cases that were bubbling up before the final case got to the Supreme Court. We're in a moment of tectonic shifts in law and policy. The Congress passed just a few days before Bruen, the Bruen finding, holding from the Supreme Court, its own gun law or gun reform measures and gun violence and gun safety measures. It was the first time in 50 years that they had passed such a statute. And they did this, I think, knowing very well that the Bruen opinion was coming down. And so we're in this moment of clash between the way people think about safety and what government can do and what law and policy can do to ensure our safety, and what law and policy can do to ensure safety without exacting an unreasonable, intolerable cost of the pursuit of our rights under the Second Amendment. And so we're in a moment of extreme tension. Then I want to go through in detail through Bruen, because Bruen has set the stage for the next at least 6 or 7 years of litigation and changes in law and statute. And I think it's as profound a decision in terms of our own personal safety and public safety as was the Dobbs decision on reproductive rights and decisions coming down the road, probably within the next year on marriage rights. So these are very, very critical, monumental shifts. We're in for a very bumpy and heavy ride over the next almost decade. So let's start with some basics. So I didn't put up a lot of charts. I'm going to give you bullet points about what the literature says. The literature is vast. Most of the time it reaches agreement. Sometimes it doesn't reach agreement, but the bullet points that you're going to see are the ones that actually are the points of agreement. The ones in red are where you have really strong agreement. So let's begin. The nation is awash in guns. It's astonishing when we compare gun possession in the US with gun possession in any other country in the world, including the most violent countries in the world. There's roughly 350 million guns in circulation by our best estimate, more coming online each year through manufacture. Many are recycled through gun shows and being stolen and so on. But it's astonishing to think that there are more guns than people in the US. Not everybody has a gun. Probably about half the households in the US actually have one or more guns. That's a very high rate. Men and white Americans have the highest rates of gun ownership. It's divided by political affiliation. It's divided by where we live, cities, suburbs, and rural areas. Gun owners are not one-time buyers. They own more than one gun. The odds of somebody getting a second gun having bought a first one are very, very high. And they tend to have grown up in gun-owning households. These are not people who were initiated into guns in their adult lives or their older adolescent lives. They come from gun-owning households. So this is a tradition in a sense, and something that I think defines somewhat their family ties and their own family network, familial network ties as well. If we look at where guns are located, guns are located all over the country, but they're highest in the states where the incarceration rates are the highest. They're highest in the states with the highest infant mortality rates, the highest premature death rates, and the lowest education rates. So there's something about socio-economic deprivation and isolation which tends to lend itself towards guns and towards gun possession. The thing that's, I think, the most important thing to remember is that guns are really easy to get. You can get them at a gun store. You can get them at a gun show, which are basically deregulated markets. Gun stores are plentiful. The federal government regulates who has the license to sell it. It's called an FFL, Federal Firearm License, but they're easy to get. And there's also a vigorous underground trade in guns as well. We know that because we know that many of the guns that I saw in the streets that the young men were using in the 3 neighborhoods in New York were all obtained through the illegal markets. So here's the homicide data. Homicide risks are greatest for males between 16 and 24. They're highest for African Americans. Latinx people come in second. Whites have the lowest risk of death by firearm homicide. Firearms account for more than half of all the homicide deaths beginning in the mid-1970s. So just to give what this means is this. There's a national archive of homicide cases, and the data are very, very deep and very rich. Sometime in the mid-1970s, roughly 1975, the percentage of all homicides that were committed with a gun became more than half. And that was the tipping point in the mid-1970s. And you can see some of the effect, but that was growing over time. It just reached that point in the mid-1970s. So you can see the rest of the bullet points, but those are the ones that are probably the most important. The one on the bottom is interesting. I think that's a little shaky on the research, but it's very provocative to think that we arm ourselves and we shoot other people when we don't trust the government, either to keep us safe or to restrain them from attacking us. Suicides are neglected. We neglect the importance of firearm suicides, but if you have a loved one or a neighbor or a friend who's used a gun to take her or his own life, it touches you, and we understand then how poignant this is. So they're higher in states where the rates of firearm and the rates of home ownership of firearms are the highest. The presence of a gun in the home is the single highest risk for firearm suicide. Sounds tautological, but it's not. If there's no gun in the home, then there are suicides, but they are not by firearms. It's a pretty good dose response. They increases 3%. The number of homicides increased by 3% for each 1% increase in household access to firearms. That's a big, big response rate given the number of guns in circulation. Men ages 15 to 34 are the ones who are at highest risk for firearm suicide. There isn't a really strong racial component on suicide, on gun suicide. I find that interesting compared to the homicide data. And they're clustered by place and time. So my colleague in epidemiology, Maddie Gould, has charted some of this, and she's written extensively about suicide clusters, both by gun and non-gun, but they're suicide clusters. And they rise, they peak, and then they dissipate over time, but they're very specific to a locale, a county or a region of a state. And again, this to me is a sign of contagion of gun violence and gun homicides. So contagion is a real factor that we need to think about. And quite honestly, there isn't really enough research going on about the contagious aspects of gun violence. And I could write and have written a theory about the contagion aspects of gun violence, but we really need to think about how to do this research systematically over time. Mass shootings are what's on our mind because of what's happened in the last few weeks, the last few months. They have been on our mind over time. There's a lot of, the rates are going up on mass shootings. Mass shootings, we define them generally as 4 or more victims. And they've increased, they took off, they were sort of flat up to about 2000, the late 1990s, and then they took off very slowly. And some point in the mid-2000s, 2006, 7, 8, they began to increase. Since 2013, the rate has gone up almost geometrically. It's an astonishing level of increase. And it's happening in exactly the same moment when we're in the midst of the 20-year decline in firearm homicides. And I find that really astonishing. Why this would be the case is very hard to explain. They tend to be different people. They tend to take place in different places. The demography of mass shootings is different than the demography of everyday gun violence, but they're different. Most mass shootings are committed with assault weapons or automatic weapons, the kind that were banned under the assault weapons ban during the early 2000s. And if you look at gun laws, and I'll have a lot to say about gun laws in a little while, but if you look at gun laws, we know that gun laws in the states where the laws are the most permissive, where it's easiest to get a gun, where there are the fewest legal barriers to owning a gun, licensing regimes, background checks are weak to non-existent, and so on. Those are the states with the highest rates of gun ownership, and those are the places where mass shootings tend to be the highest. We just don't see them very often in places like California or New York, other than the Buffalo shooting, which tend to be places that have very strong gun laws. We tend to see it in places, when you think about the totality of these things, going back over 10 or 15 years, these are the places, the permissive gun law states are the places that have those. And I'll discuss, well, if there are questions about what we mean by permissive gun laws, I'll be happy to go into that. Where do the guns come from? These are mostly, there are both crime guns that are used to commit homicides, and a lot of them are crime guns. And then there are guns that are used, guns that are used in suicides and others that come through different sources. So these are the crime guns. When we think about homicides on the south side of Chicago or in neighborhoods in New York City, the rates have climbed there, or in South Philly, the rates have climbed there as well. I'm sorry, North Philly. Where do the guns come from? And that's really critical to ask. They didn't just drop out of the sky, and some guy didn't just drop them off in the street corner. You can see 4 different versions of different places around the country. The California rates are the lower right-hand corner. Illinois is the bottom in the middle. New York is on the upper left, and Florida is on the upper right. And you'd see the numbers are where the guns came from. And I think that's fascinating. So New York guns, for example, 347 crime guns in New York within the calendar year 2015 came from Florida. 400 of them came from Georgia, which is where there's a heavy gun manufacturing business. 441 from Virginia, which is a pipeline. There's definitely a gun pipeline up the East Coast, up the I-95 corridor. And it works the opposite way also. You can see the Florida recovery rates. Florida, most of the guns in Florida are coming from within Florida. That's the 11,000 cases. But for the most part, they're getting guns from Georgia as well, from Mississippi, et cetera. Illinois, you can see the pipeline up from the south into the city of Chicago. I've studied gun violence in Illinois, and we know that the ring of cities in northwestern Indiana that surrounds southeastern Cook County, where Chicago is rich with gun shops. And the Chicago police do an excellent job at tracing the sources of gun crimes that they're able to recover. And the overwhelming majority of them come either from a small number of gun dealers just outside of Cook County in Chicago, but the overwhelming majority come from the Indiana gun dealers. So people are driving to Indiana, buying tons of guns, trafficking them into the south side of Chicago. They go down onto the street, they're sold on the street, and then gun violence erupts. And we know the tragic stories about Chicago. One last thing. We would like to know a whole lot more about firearm research. We know a lot, but for a very, very long time, we didn't know anything. And here's what happened. There was a study published in the early 2000s by a doctor, Arthur Kellerman, who compared gun violence rates in Seattle with gun violence rates in Vancouver, Canada. And we all know that Canada is a very different place with respect to guns. They're rare, they're hard to get. Most people don't have them, most people don't use them. Seattle is a typical American city with a fair rate of gun violence, not as bad as other places. But what he found was that over time, the gun violence rates in Seattle were far lower than the gun violence rates in Vancouver. Now, it's a relevant comparison. The demography and the socio-economic structure of Seattle looks a whole lot like the socio-economic structure and demography of Vancouver. They're both very pretty places. They're both surrounded by mountains. They both have tourist trades and so on. So I think it's, he published this stuff and it created a real outcry. The gun lobby, and there is a very powerful gun lobby, as I think we all know, was very angry about it, and they were outraged, and they felt that the science wasn't as strong as it could be, and so this was smearing the gun industry in a way that would lead to restrictive laws, and that people would be deprived of their Second Amendment rights. So Congressman Dickey introduces the Dickey Amendment. And the Dickey Amendment basically says you can't spend money in CDC or NIJ, or the Department of Justice, to fund gun violence research. Not only that, but the Dickey Amendment said you can't talk about it. And that was really astonishing. That was one of the first lessons of censorship that I can remember in my time about studying any kind of criminal justice policy in public. The period of time when the Dickey Amendment also was passed and put into act was tied to a budget. It wasn't actually voted on. It was tied to a budget package, an appropriation. And so it stood for decades. The Dickey Amendment was enacted at a time when there was a surge of litigation against the gun manufacturers, stemming from homicides, gun homicides, and mass shootings, and other gun violence events across the country, mostly in the big cities. And there was one in New York for you New Yorkers. There's one in San Francisco. They were really all over the country. There's the LA case and so on. Not only was the Dickey Amendment passed in that context historically, but the Dickey Amendment also was accompanied by something called the PLCAA. If we were in law school, I'd ask somebody to raise their hand, or I'd call on you to tell me what that is. But I'll tell you, it's the Prevention of Commerce Unlawful Arms Acts. In a sense, it was a shield of gun manufacturers from civil litigation, from civil liability, for having manufactured guns that somehow got into the wrong hands and were used in the commission of a homicide. Dickey, shortly before his death a couple of years ago, said he regretted very much the Dickey Amendment, but I can't tell you how profound the effects of the Dickey Amendment were, and together with the PLCAA, in shutting down challenges to the gun lobby and to the gun industry in terms of their marketing, which is fairly aggressive, of gun firearms. So I think it was an important episode. Dickey, I think after a series of mass shootings in the middle of the 2000s, Aurora, Illinois, and one or two others, had some regrets for what he had done in pursuing the amendment. Let's talk a little bit about what happened in the past couple of years, because the past couple of years are extremely different. This is what we call in statistics a discontinuity from the overall trend. And here's what I mean. So this is a sample of 22 different cities. These are data compiled by the Council on Criminal Justice in Washington, DC, which is a public policy place that studies issues in crime and justice, incarceration rates, different models of treatment and intervention with offenders. They happened to take on the pandemic question very seriously when it became obvious that homicides were spiking during that period of time. So you can see very clearly in March of 2020, at the onset of the pandemic, homicide rates in 22 cities took off, and they spiked really high. So these are the homicides per 100,000 population. Now, so it's 2.5. Let me give you a little bit of context. At the very peak in 1993, 1991 or 93, it depends on where you were living, the gun homicide rate in the US, that rate was actually 10 per 100,000 people. So although we're scared of guns right now, and we have every reason to be scared of guns, we're nowhere near the level of gun violence that we lived through and really conquered compared to what happened in the mid to late 1990s. And I'll talk a little bit more of that in a second. But anyway, if you follow this chart, you can see it follows a little bit of a seasonal phenomenon. So it takes off in March of 2020, rises through the warm weather months through September. Finally, by October and November, it's declining. When you get to March, we're kind of at the end of the winter of 21, and then lo and behold, it takes off again. Now, some people think it has to do with the pandemic. Other people thinks it has to do with some of the civil unrest surrounding the George Floyd murder. But if you look at this chart, George Floyd was murdered in May of 2020. And the homicide spiked well before that. They were spiking at least 2 months before that. So I'm not so sure about the civil unrest owing to the George Floyd murder, although that was terrible and quite palpable. But you can't lay it off only on that. So this is important to keep in mind. In 2021 so far, the data suggests that the epidemic, the gun violence epidemic, is diminishing. Whether it takes back up again with a new variant, with the BA5 variant, we really don't know. But at the moment, it's diminishing into 2022. One thing we do know, though, is that this pandemic effect didn't affect all cities the same. In fact, the effects were really quite different, and you can see the differences in the effects. So at the bottom, there's 3 different cities, maybe 4 if you include DC, but particularly 2, St. Petersburg, Florida, and Austin, Texas, which had astronomical increases in firearm homicide rates during that period of time. Most of the cities experienced somewhat smaller bumps. Philadelphia and Los Angeles, a couple of other cities, including the district, had more modest increases, but sizable increases nonetheless. Now, one thing to keep in mind about the pandemic effect. In the pandemic effect, you would expect that all manner of violence would increase. Robberies, because people would have more guns, burglaries, because they would force their way into a house, assaults on the street, because they would have guns and they'd beat people up, they'd pistol whip them. None of that happened. The increase in gun violence during the pandemic and into the pandemic to the current day is almost exclusively an increase in murders and homicides. I find that's really, to me, very remarkable. Here's an example from New York data. I've circled the 2 lines. My graph drawing software didn't cooperate, but the data on the bottom are the years 2008 through 21. So year 14 is 21. And you can see for 20 and 21, the green line, which is assaults, those went up. And the blue line is murder, and those went up. But the other stuff didn't. So this is a pattern that's fairly typical across the large cities in the country. New York is a little exceptional on the assault rate. If we go back to the study that was done by the Council on Criminal Justice, they find no effect on assaults. In New York, we observe an effect on assaults. In Philadelphia, where I've done some work also, we see no effect on assaults. So maybe there's something unique about New York, we don't really know. But the point is the deflection point starting in 2020 with gun homicide. So the pandemic has really raised the rates, and it's led to a political disruption. So we have a mayor who was elected in New York, a former police officer, on a strong law and order platform. There's been somewhat of an uprising against prosecutors who are more reluctant to prosecute minor cases, but that seems to have been spilled over in the public imagination to more serious cases, but that's not the case. That's a different conversation. These increases, regardless of where they sit in historical terms, and they're much lower, still have exacted a much higher cost with respect to political unrest resulting from the homicides. If we step back a minute, you can see here, and I'm going to use my pointer. So this is the homicide spike that began in the 1960s, peaked in the early 1970s, declined somewhat, peaked again in 1979 or 80, declined precipitously, and then peaked again up through here, which is 1990, 1991, and then began a 25-year decline. Now, if we were in a classroom, I'd say, who remembers what those years were like? None of you, because you'd all be too young. But I do, because I lived through it. So here's the answer. This was a period when there was a heroin epidemic in the major cities of the United States. The heroin epidemic led to major social disruptions and a very vigorous street market in heroin. And a lot of the violence we observed was market violence, dealers shooting one another on the street. Here, this is the powdered cocaine epidemic. And the same thing happened. So this was the emergence of street markets. People could just simply go to open air bazaars and buy drugs. Think about, for example, those of you who watched The Wire. You could see in the Amsterdam episode, you can see the way those open air markets worked. And so that declined as that particular drug epidemic declined. This drug epidemic declined. And then the crack epidemic came along. And zoom, it shot up. And so here we have a third drug epidemic. So when I talk about contagion, it's really a much more complicated and nuanced conversation because we're not quite sure if the drug epidemics, which were somewhat contagious, led to a contagion of violence to sustain those markets in 3 different phases. So this is something important for us to think about. We're in an era now where we have a pandemic. It's not a drug epidemic, but it certainly is a disease epidemic. We don't have the same street violence owing to the drug markets. We have a different kind of violence of people who are sort of confined in their spaces. And I think that's one of the things to keep in mind about the era that we're in and making some sense about tying these three things together. This is a remarkable decline. We've never seen anything like this decline over time. And I'll show you in 1 second on the next slide why this is completely unique. This, by the way, the yellow period is when the assault weapons ban was in effect from the mid-1990s, 1994 to 2004, roughly. And so we broke this out into handgun crimes and other firearms. And when you add these two together, you basically get this. Okay. So this is the modern era, sort of the post-World War II era. What happens when we look even further back? So here we see homicides. Here are the three epidemics we just talked about. 1, 2, 3. This one's a little bumpy. This is, I have to say, this is all New York data, but it follows the national data with this exception here. So there's 1, 2, 3. But then there was a big decline in the 1940s during World War II and after World War II, and it took off again in the 1960s. So this is what the story that we just told. But what happened in here? These were firearm homicides. This was the era of prohibition, which was in here, but this wasn't prohibition. This was a very unstable social era. This was the era of the Roaring Twenties, when there was extraordinary wealth being accumulated, but also extraordinary gaps between the rich and the poor. People were going boom or bust. An era of intense immigration, an era of in-migration in the cities for people moving from the south to the northern cities, including Chicago, and also to the western cities. There was a migration into the Los Angeles area. But when we think about really bad times with guns and gun violence, we look here, but we have to remember we've been seeing this for well over a century. We're now into 2022, and if we carried this graph forward, we'd be up here. Remember, this is 10 per 100,000. We're at 2.5 per 100,000, but the size of the spike is something that we worry about. Okay, by the way, I just wanted to say that this book was done, this is data compiled by Eric Monkinen, who was a brilliant historian and died way too young. He was a historian at UCLA, a friend of mine. His work has really made a major contribution to the way we think about this. One other piece of data. We know that we talked about the supply of guns, and the supply of guns is substantial and formidable. So what's happened? This is a chart of the number of background checks recorded by the FBI under their NICS system, which is their firearm background check data system. And now we're looking here from January of 20 to January of 21. So this is a full 2 years of data plus 1 month. The little peaks and valleys here are seasonal trends. So if we put a regression line in here, it would look pretty much straight like this. But look at the way it took off starting in January of 20. That's quite amazing. So we don't really understand what happened in here. Some people like to think of it as the Ferguson effect, where there were riots in a fair number of cities protesting the murder of Michael Brown and the unrest about policing and police effects in minority neighborhoods. But that's kind of here, and that's flat, and it's not that big a bump compared to here. It takes off really in January of 20, but why does it take off in advance of the pandemic? So again, if we're in the classroom, I'd call for your guesses and your educated responses. There is no consensus about why we see here what we're seeing. I think the consensus has to do with fear of what's going to happen in the next election. So remember, President Trump is elected in here, he takes office in here. He's very friendly to the gun lobby. He's encouraging the assertion of Second Amendment rights. Now we're worried, or his followers are worried, or the general public's worried, he may not be elected, and a new president would come in who wants to impose regulations on firearms. And so people start to gun up. And so here, they've gunned up. And now they've really gunned up because now we're in the middle of the homicide epidemic, the pandemic, the homicide epidemic associated with the pandemic. Does this translate into the supply of guns and the rates of homicide? Well, they certainly map in terms of being coterminous. There's no real hard evidence that the guns that are being used today on the street are the same guns that were being purchased and survived into legal purchase through a background check. But it sure looks like, given everything we understand about the leakage of guns from legal ownership to illegal ownership, through theft, through people just making straw purchases and handing them down, through a variety of mechanisms, some of what we see on the street today is the result of leakage from the legal purchases. Here's the data on mass shootings. People count these things in very different ways. It's interesting. If you go to a place called the Gun Violence Archive, which is somewhat in disrepute with more conservative people who think it's just run by a bunch of gun control nuts, you get a different count, but the trend lines look the same. This is a much more conservative tally that's done by an organization that compiles statistics on crime and justice. And so here we see we're in roughly 1998. What happened in here? The mass shootings at Columbine and the mass shooting in Louisiana. And so there was somewhat of a little bit of uptake in here. Then it's pretty steady and pretty slow, shoots up in here, which is roughly around the time of Waco. And then it really takes off in 16, 17, and 18. And that tends to follow, I think, 16, 17, and 18 is the onset of the big increase in background checks and the purchase of firearms. Whatever the cause, whatever the reason, we're seeing a tremendous increase in the number of mass shootings in these years. And we're only halfway through this year, and we're already at 7 by this count. By other counts, we're at roughly, again, we're on a pace to go well above what the peak rates were, even within different counting systems. So there's something going on, and we know from the conversation that we're having tonight, based on what happened in Indianapolis, what happened in Highland Park, what happened in Uvalde, what happened in Buffalo, and what happens every day on the south side of Chicago and in the South Bronx and in other areas of the cities all over the US. We're definitely into an area at a time when these things are going to start kicking up. So let's talk about law. And I want to kind of get through the law conversation because it's really important, because this is the world that we're going to be living in for at least the next half dozen years, maybe longer. One thing we know about laws, we've known this for a very long period of time, going back maybe to 2010, 2012, when researchers first began counting the number of laws that were in place by state. And we know that states that have more gun laws in effect have lower homicide rates, lower gun homicide rates. It's a very simple effect. It varies from state to state about which particular gun law, but the very strong, robust statistical fact is that the more gun restrictions there are in a place, the greater the lower the gun homicide rate in that place. I call it density of laws. As best we understand, the law that has the most effect is background checks. Background checks are something that are deeply opposed by pro-gun lobbies and pro-gun people. But they are the ones that make the most difference. And this is true across multiple studies that have looked at these effects, including one that we did that was published in the Lancet. The assault weapons ban had mixed effects. It's interesting. But in the assault weapons ban was some restrictions on high capacity magazines. And that was the most effective provision of the assault weapons ban. So there were mass shootings during that time, but the number of killings in those mass shootings was reduced by 10 to 15% because of the ban on high capacity magazines. The courts are not friendly to that ban. California shot it down in a couple of different cases. I believe once we get into the post-Bruin era, when cases start to bubble up in the circuit courts and then to the Supreme Court, that ban on high capacity magazines will fall. So here are the laws that matter. And this is what we've learned from research up to and including the moment of Bruin. Background checks work to curtail homicides. When we restrict gun access, possession prohibition for people convicted of violent misdemeanors, basically misdemeanor assaults, that reduces homicide rates. If we bump up the age of purchase to 21, that's both for assault weapons and also for handguns. That works. As I said before, the restrictions on high-capacity magazines work. And there's been some excellent research at Duke and other places on red flag laws, and they tend to work as well. What doesn't work? Well, two things: permitless carry and stand your ground laws. Permitless carry is a version of the shall issue law, but stand your ground laws are what we know them to be. Permitless carry is interesting. Let me give one example. The state of Missouri for several years had in effect a law requiring a permit to purchase a gun, not to carry, but to purchase a gun. And quite suddenly, after being in effect for a number of years, that ban was lifted. It was lifted roughly in the maybe about a decade ago. In the years after that, in the immediate 5 to 7 years, the gun homicide rate jumped. So it wasn't so much in the story in Missouri, it wasn't so much that we prohibited people to get guns or that they had to register or any other kind of restriction. We just didn't make it easy for people to get to purchase them. And as soon as that was lifted, when you take a law away, then the gun homicide rate goes up. And that's one of the lessons that we learned there. Suicide rates have a little bit of a different set of predictors. Permitless carry laws increase homicide risk because it's easier for guns to get into everyone's hands when permitless carry is in effect. Bans on junk guns and high-capacity magazines reduce the risks, but there's really no clear pattern other than the fact of a gun being owned in the home that poses the risk of a firearm homicide. It's fascinating how, I don't know, egalitarian maybe is one way to think about it. So this is Bruin, and I'm going to turn off the slides in a minute and talk in more detail narratively about Bruin. We know that Bruin will result in more people carrying guns and more people on the streets carrying concealed weapons. And if you think back to the first few slides, and particularly to that contagion, that character contest, that scripted violence that we observed, I think we're going to see more of that. And that's tough, because one thing that we know is that even in places that have local gun laws, and under Bruin, they're going to fall, but up to and including the moment of Bruin, even if you passed a law in your state, many state legislatures passed laws, additional laws, preempting a locality for enacting its own gun restriction. And this is an astonishing map. This is 45 out of the 50 states that would tell a municipality, you can't have a gun control law. You can't kick a dealer out of your perimeters, out of your municipality. You can't do it. The only places that we don't know about are the District of Columbia and Hawaii. There's no data on whether or not there's preemption. The places that have preemption are New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Delaware, the usual suspects. So that's our case. Maryland does have a preemption law. So we could have something in effect in Prince George's County. It could be preempted by the state if somebody wanted to trigger the preemption mechanism. But so far we don't have any evidence or good data about how often preemption laws are taken into effect. My colleague at the law school at Columbia, Richard Prof, has written about these and is, whenever we have a conversation about it, he raises the alarm. He thinks this is something that's endangering basically all of us. So I want to shut the slides off and talk more narratively about Bruin and about what it means and why it's going to have an effect. Let me shut off the share for the moment. And just let me give you some sense about the way that Bruin works. So at first glance, the substance of Bruin was fairly simple. Bruin struck down the New York state law requiring people to show proper cause before carrying a concealed handgun in public, before obtaining a license to carry a concealed handgun in public. In Greenwood, I forgot the name of the place in Indiana, forgive me, but in the Indiana shooting, Governor Holcomb had signed on July 1st of 2022, maybe 2 weeks before the shooting in the mall, a law that basically said well, basically lifted any restrictions whatsoever on people having access to firearms other than age. And so it looks an awful lot like the law that was struck down in New York State. There were licensing requirements. You had to pass a background check and so on. That law was struck down. And what remained was extremely little. You had to go through a minimal background check and that was it. So basically it went overnight from a restricted gun market to a free market in guns. And what we saw was fairly quickly a shooter that comes into the mall and starts shooting up the mall and kills a few people. So in one sense, Bruin simplifies all of the stuff in New York State and other states that had licensing requirements, expands the right to carry a concealed weapon in most places, and it converts New York State from what we call in research or in law a may issue state to a shall issue state. It shifts the burden from the applicant to the state in terms of the applicant had the burden before of showing why the applicant should get a license. Now the state has to bear the burden of showing why that applicant should not get a license. The law in New York stood for 111 years. Through homicide spikes and homicide declines, it was in effect for the 25-year period of decline in New York State. And New York had gone from, in that 25-year period, the nation's highest homicide rate in 1991 to the nation's lowest homicide rate among the urbanized states by 2010. So that law now is out of, we no longer have that law in effect for us. The ruling negates similar laws in different states, California, New Jersey, Hawaii, several others. And in those states, nearly 25%, 80 million Americans live in those states. And so they lived in states that had very, very effective licensing regimes. And under Bruin, those licensing regimes are likely to fall. And Bruin limits the power of lawmakers to regulate concealed handguns because those regulations are about to fall under Bruin and under the tests that are coming down the pike for Bruin. Bruin asks for a showing of proper cause to issue a permit to carry a concealed weapon. And that showing, that demand in New York under the 111-year-old law was found to be unconstitutional. And they said basically it places an impermissible burden on the applicant who's seeking to exercise a legitimate and sacred Second Amendment right. There still may be barriers to obtaining such a law. You can't be a minor, just a permanent, so you probably can't be a minor and several others. Persons convicted of domestic violence laws. The presumption that the need for an applicant can be, but what's relaxed is that the presumption of need can be something as simple as I'm afraid, I'm out late at night, I've been victimized before. There's really no limit on what the basis is of making a claim for proper cause. And some judges are going to be very friendly to that, and they will be as expansive as the law allows them to be, and some judges will be restrictive. And it really devolves the authority for who gets the permit and who doesn't to judges and expands their judicial authority. And we know that the majority of the Supreme Court is not really fond of the idea of expanded judicial authority, but that's going to be one of the consequences of the Bruin law. So we don't know much about the Greenwood Mall shooter. We know that Governor Holcomb signed the law very shortly after Bruin came down. One thing we know is that in that state, this was being debated, it had passed the legislature with a signing date in advance of July 1st. The police agencies up and down the state of Indiana were begging the governor not to sign it. But it turns out the shooter in Greenwood was well within his rights under Indiana law to bring that weapon into the mall. He could, well within his rights to conceal it on his person or in a handbag. He carried a little suitcase with the weaponry into the bathroom, set himself up to do the shooting and came out. To carry it onto the mall, and the mall actually had a restriction on on carrying weapons within the premises. And that's going to be a point of contention as the law shakes itself out. So this is an example of what Bruin is going to tolerate and allow. And not just this, it's going to be the kind of character contest that we saw for kids and in bar fights when we did our study of contagion in New York. And this is what should be concerning to most of us. So given what we know and what little we know, what are the effects that we expect Bruin to have? So states like Indiana that have statutes that align very closely with the Bruin holding are going to adopt procedures and standards to conform with the ruling. That means some kind of licensing test, whether it be an interview, whether it be filling out a form, whether it be pro forma, like registering your car. We don't really know. But we know that 25 states already have those statutes in effect, and the other 25 plus the district are now going to have statutes that in one form or another that will uphold that whole thing. There already is pushback in some of the blue states. So we know that in New York, they're going to adopt measures that, even though they conform on the surface of Brune, they're going to create a number of restrictions on places where concealed carry can take place, and on the terms for issuing a concealed carry permit as well. So New York has already defined sensitive locations where you can't carry a gun. So for example, and concealed carry. So for example, places like Central Park, schools, college campuses, hospitals, Yankee Stadium, Madison Square Garden, concert venues, the US Open in Forest Hills, the tennis tournament. I'm not Forest Hills, I'm dating myself, in Queens. Transportation hubs like airports, where we already have those restrictions, but now train stations and so on. The owner of a bar or restaurant can choose whether or not to institute such policies. So a bar or restaurant, a shop, a private property owner of any sort, I could do it in my home, can post a notice that firearms are not permitted on that site. And when they do that, they're going to risk some conflict with those who will not have access to those places. People who want to carry guns into those places, your favorite restaurant perhaps, won't be able to do so if that restaurant has a policy in effect and it's well posted, and the signage is clear that they can't do it. So this is in New York. Even if permission's granted in these places on a case-by-case basis, it's not clear what's going to constitute what is required under New York law now, clear and conspicuous signage, and what language will be used by the property owner to convey express consent, because those are the two stipulations that are built into the New York law. On top of that, property owners are going to have to avoid discrimination claims. You're going to have to treat everybody equally. You can't pick and choose who you're going to let in carry it. It's got to be by a rule that's posted that applies to everybody. And of course, this is going to raise tensions. It's going to create the conflict for the potential for conflict and probably for some litigation. One thing that hasn't happened, I mean, there are some restrictions on bars. I would assume that they are, but given the evidence about alcohol and violence, a state may very well decide to ban concealed carry in places where alcohol is sold or served. I think the evidence on alcohol and violence is extremely strong and reliable. And so I think this is going to be, again, a point of contention. It's going to be a real rough ride over the next several years. What works? Red flag laws work. Enhanced background checks work. Closing the boyfriend loophole, that will help save some lives in domestic violence situations. Age restrictions on the purchase of assault rifles. Those are the things that are in the 2022 congressional bill, and they're unlikely to survive. New York has a set of laws that are really quite stringent now, apart from what I just mentioned. They allow for police or law enforcement to scan social media of an applicant to look for violent messaging that might bear on that person's, quote, character and conduct. Persons of histories of alcohol-related misdemeanors, criminal histories, deep background checks, including mental health as well as criminal history, periodic background checks for people who already hold a permit, age restrictions consistent with the federal bill, searches of juvenile records, which generally are sacrosanct from those kinds of searches. There's an exception made now for firearms. Rigorous checks and documentation on histories of domestic violence, and also on red flag laws. Compliance with gun safety training requirements. Some places are going to say you have to pass a test in order to get this license. And that will, you can imagine what the points of contention are going to be about that. There's a number of statutes that are considered to be presumptively lawful, as defined by Kavanaugh and Roberts in their concurrence. And so, for example, a ban on firearms in airplanes is likely to meet that presumptively lawful test. But that test itself is going to be subject to lots of tests, or lots of litigation as we try and understand the parameter of that. And so a protracted legal battle is really inevitable. The Supreme Court is limiting itself to sanctioning those restrictions that are part of the nation's, that are reasonably analogous to part of the nation's longstanding historical tradition. Those states I mentioned before, California, Hawaii, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, those states have some of the lowest gun homicide rates in the country, but Bruin is going to do away with a lot of the measures that are actually in place in those states. Unless they're grandfathered in, but we don't see any sign that that will be the case. So I could go on. There's a lot here to talk about constitutionality. There's a lot here to talk about mass shootings. I do want to call attention to one fact. There was an agency, and the study is publicized has been criticized pretty well, that over the last decade, there have been 433 active shooter events. And how many bystanders were present to disrupt those events, including Greenwood? 22. So the idea that the bystanders are there and they're going to save us because they're carrying guns and the would-be bad guys can't see the guns, and so they're going to get shot and killed, I think those bystanders are unicorns. And I think it's going to be reckless to base law and policy on their presence and the social science evidence, which is cited in the Bruin opinion, saying that, well, this is a real big deal. We know that the more people who carry them, the greater the deterrent effect. That's bad evidence. It's been repudiated in a number of different social science venues and journals. I don't think we want to base our hopes for safety down the road. So I know that we need to get out and open up the conversation for questions from you all. There's more to say. I have a note here that says discuss among yourselves. So let's all discuss together among ourselves. I yield the floor.
Thank you so much. We have a ton of questions already coming in. My name is Miyako Yarek. I'm the administrator for the DC-based Columbia Alumni Club. We had a comment earlier. We hope you're doing okay there without AC or fan or anything. So we do have a bunch of questions, close to 15 already coming in. If you do have further questions, please use the Q&A box so that we can go through them and try and get to them in the next half hour. So we had a couple questions come in early about the Second Amendment. And so maybe we could start there. Alan asked if you could interpret the Second Amendment word for word, comma for comma, but what do you think? What do you think the
I don't think that's the best use of our time. We're Columbia graduates. We figure it out ourselves.
Okay, he did ask what you think the founders' intention was for the Second Amendment.
Historians disagree about this. They disagree vociferously. I think that question really turns on whether they intended this to be for militias and for the right of people to defend themselves in the context of somebody trying to assert governmental control over them. Others seem to think that somehow, beginning with Heller in 2010 in the US Supreme Court, that right extended to personal possession. There's really nothing in the Second Amendment about carry. So the Bruin opinion extends the Second Amendment to carry. So it's really a contested claim about whether or not this applies beyond the militia context. The historians read the canon of historical documents. And they've done it in Bruin. There's one of the amicus briefs in the Bruin case was about the English common law and the English laws in effect in the 13th century in England about carrying weapons. And they were prohibited. The Bruin majority seemed to interpret the history in a different way. I've read two historical accounts and two different amicus briefs that give pretty convincing arguments that it wasn't really an open carry regime in England in the time leading up to, I guess, the founding of the US. And there already were common sense restrictions in place in the US. One of the things that's important to point out is that Justice Barrett, in a Seventh Circuit opinion before she went up to the Supreme Court, talked a lot about sensible firearm restrictions. She had no problem with those. And in the concurrence, Roberts and Kavanaugh both talk about sensible restrictions. Now, how that's going to be debated and sorted out when those sensible restrictions come to be challenged in conference in the Supreme Court, as well as by a large number of appellate court judges in the circuits, we really don't know. But to get back to the core question, I think it really does turn on how you as a scholar or you as a citizen read the Second Amendment. I tend to think that it's very thin to argue that this has to do with personal possession and has much more to do with the militia concept to ward off enemies and invading enemies.
Okay, we had a few questions about specific slides that you had in your presentation. So a few of them mentioned the slides, but I'm going to just try and keep it general so we don't open them back up. James says, how would you assess the prospects for success or failure of a federal gun buyback program?
There's 350 million plus guns in the US. The buyback programs that have been very successful took place mainly in Australia. That's the one that's given the most credit. Canada had a very successful buyback program, but those are very different societies with very smaller number of guns. And probably, although both places have pro-gun lobbies within their political structures, it's nowhere near the urgency and emotion of the pro-gun lobby in the US and the Second Amendment rights people who assert that right and who argue for really as few restrictions as possible. So I'm not confident. I'm confident more in the idea of incentivizing manufacturers to produce fewer guns. That's a very, very different proposition. We could give them, if we wanted to pass such a law, we could give them tax breaks. We could encourage them. We can make the tax laws very different. The greater the decline, we could ration the number of guns that they could produce. We could apply restrictions to the production of guns the way that we apply them to the production of dynamite or the production of nitroglycerin. I think that buyback programs that are really retail in nature are less likely to succeed than programs and policies that are more wholesale in nature.
And I think you had a slide on this, but given the 350 million guns that are now, can you kind of talk us through when that kind of exploded in the proliferation of them in the US over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if you go back and look at the slide on the NICS checks, the background checks, they were going along at a fairly regular clip. And then all of a sudden they took off in really, I guess, after about 2010, 2013, after some mass shootings, but also after some civil unrest. Remember, there was very emotional events having to do with guns and violence mostly around police killings, but also around Waco and Wounded Knee and a number of different places and in the Northwest on federal land where gun owners asserted their rights to defend their land against authorities. And so I think that's probably the point where it began to trickle up. If I had to make a particular marker in time, I would say the marker was right around the formation of the Tea Party. A lot of stuff happened in 2010, right around having to do with the assertion of rights and kind of attacks on some of the restrictions on particular rights with the rise of the Tea Party and the pushback against a variety of federal controls. But that's my opinion. IMO.
So we had a question from J. Andrew Smith, who asked if you think that cops are in many people's minds part of the big bad government that people buy guns to protect against.
I think there are people who believe that. Here's an example. Now, one of the people whose work is cited by the majority in Bruin is a criminologist from Florida State University named Gary Kleck. Gary is a pretty lefty guy, many social policies, but he's also a very strong advocate of relaxed or minimal constraints on firearm access. I'm going to put words in Gary's mouth and he can come punch me in the nose if he thinks I'm wrong and yell at me. I know Gary. But I think Gary is a person who represents representative of a lot of other people who believe that the state should not have a monopoly on firearms. And that comes from both the left and the right. So I don't think that, so the answer to the questioner is kind of a yes. I don't personally think that. I have other questions about policing. But I do think that there is a deep concern over the power of police representing the state to suppress individual liberties, and no liberty more important than the Second Amendment right to keep firearms.
There's a question on printed guns and your perspective on them, or like 3D printed, and if you expect them to become more common.
Yes, I think they're a nightmare. I don't think that we figured out what to do about them. Nor have we figured out how to detect them when you're trying to get them onto an airplane. If the materials are developing so that the plastics are as hard as metals now, as metal. And so the firing pins are going to be there and the triggers are going to be there, but they're just not going to be metal. I think it's a real dangerous situation. If we enter into an era when people are a bit more restrained about using guns to settle interpersonal disputes or to intimidate domestic violence, domestic partners, which I didn't really talk much about, but that's one of the big things in the pandemic is an increase in the domestic violence population and the attacks on mostly on women, almost exclusively on women. Anyway, I think that this is going to be somewhat of a nightmare. And I think we really need to put some good minds together. Even in a world where we want unconstrained access to legal firearms, we may want to exert prohibitions on plastic guns. We can control the access to legal firearms. We don't do it really well, but we can certainly do somewhat of a job. But we can't do it with plastic guns because you and I can go home and make a gun tonight.
We had a couple of questions on insurance. So Deborah says, would there be a benefit in requiring gun owners to have liability insurance? And Thomas Milbury says, have studies been done on the use of taxes or insurance requirements in connection with gun ownership?
Very, very few studies on license on insurance. Where there has been studies on insurance, and there's a lot of very active proposals on this, is in the area of police shootings. Now, we can extrapolate from, with some difficulty, from a government agency, police force, but municipalities are now going, in many places, are letting the insurance rate setters determine what municipalities are going to pay when they're found guilty, when their officers are found guilty of an unjustified shooting, and there are damage assessments. I think that I don't see a reason not to require it. There's nothing in the Second Amendment that would speak to this. We require people to have insurance to operate motor vehicles. We require people to have insurance for medical care. All manner of life-threatening activities are regulated by insurance, and we require that insurance. And there are penalties for not having the insurance, particularly when it comes to automobiles. I think it's an area where we ought to have some very deep conversations, and I think the tension, this goes outside Bruin. Bruin is about who gets the right to carry a concealed weapon. There's nothing about Bruin that says the permit that we can't impose a licensing restriction on who gets the permit. Remember, the licensing restriction that's articulated so far in Bruin is that it has to be clear and objective, probably staying away from character traits and so on. Requiring insurance is one of those examples of something that's fairly clear and objective. And certainly the insurance industry will do a little dance to celebrate the creation of such statutes. Having said all that, I don't know of a place right now that requires insurance.
We had one question. We saw that you mentioned the violence from guns is usually male, usually white. But Aretha asked what the status of data collection is on women and gun ownership, and then also female use in violent incidents.
Their data do exist for women in violent incidents. We know that the number of women homicide perpetrators from national data maintained by the FBI is lower than 10%, and the number who use guns is lower than 5%. So it's rare. However, having said all that, guns are being very, very aggressively marketed to women now by the gun manufacturers. And I had a slide on showing some old-timey ads from the 1920s from Colt. Colt was really aiming at the market of women to buy firearms. Those same things actually, that marketing strategy is very much in effect now. And so the guns are small. They're made to stay within a purse or a carry-on purse or a shoulder bag. They may not afford, because of their size, of the protection that their owners would think, but they're better than nothing if one believes that carrying a gun is the right way to do it. One thing we don't know is that, all things being equal, can a woman who's inexperienced and is overpowered by an assailant because of the differential in physical strength, will that woman be able to get access to the gun, take it out, and use it? And I think we need to think about research about physical limitations on guns. The fact that the gun is present doesn't solve the physical limitation question. It's true with smaller people, it's true with younger people, and I think it's part of the issues of women. But I expect to see a rise in women carrying weapons. One of the issues about that went to a question like that, it's a good question, but we really have terrible data on household gun ownership. All of the studies of gun ownership are made through things as flimsy as magazine subscriptions, right? Do you have does the percentage of people in your community with a subscription to guns and ammo, is that a proxy for the number of people who own guns? Maybe yes, maybe no. But we don't have the ability to conduct research where the Gallup Corporation calls you up and says, hi, I'm from Gallup, who'd you vote for in the last election, and do you have a gun in your home? That's not going to happen, because people are just not going to answer that.
I've definitely seen ads just on random places for women advertised guns, like the bands underneath dresses or skirts, and they're definitely advertised for women recently, I think.
Oh, for sure. It's a very, if you go on the NRA website, you'll find lots of advertisements aimed at women.
Mm-hmm. And
also the manufacturers. If you go on to, well, Winchester's out of business. If you go on to Smith & Wesson, you'll find the same advertisements. They're there. Colt, Derringer.
So we've had a couple of questions about guns and minors or under 18-year-olds. I know you mentioned raising the age to 21 might help, but so Jim says, what is the legal liability of an adult or parent who purchases the gun for a minor, and then that child commits the crime? I think this is in a case coming up soon. And then,
we're gonna find out the answer to that question very soon. Both particularly I think in the Uvalde shooting.
Mm-hmm.
But we've known this before. I think the law is still working itself out on this. Part of the law, so there's a negligence aspect to the law. Is it negligent to purchase a gun for a minor, knowing that minor doesn't have the right mental capacity to exercise sound judgment and restraint? Is it gross negligence that would elevate the penalties that might be imposed on a parent? Does simple negligence mean something like a monetary fine? Will there be a deprivation of liberty? It really depends on the way that the statutes are written. And those statutes are going to be written probably with more frequency and in more detail in the next several years. And I think particularly after Bruin, when more people are going to run around carrying. But the age 18 barrier is not going anywhere. Mm-hmm. That's something that's written in stone. We know it's true for voting, and it's true for military service, signing contracts and the like. That's not going anywhere. And I'm very happy about that, because we know that brains really aren't developed, not even by 18, it's up to 21. If it were up to me, knowing what I know about neuroscience and adolescent violence, I would impose an age 21 restrictions on purchasing firearms for minors or for young adults. Mm-hmm. Any firearm.
Do you have data that talks about gun violence with legal versus illegal guns, or licensed versus unlicensed shooters?
Well, on the former, yes, we have plenty of data on that. The FBI and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives, they have a long name now. They run a gun recovery system. So when a police department recovers a gun, they give it to the ATF. They trace the gun back to its manufacturer. We can do an autopsy or a life history of the gun, try and figure out how many hands it's passed through. That's arduous work to do, but we know certainly from the point of manufacture to the point of sale, when the sales are registered legally, because there is background checks right now, we can figure out how many guns the moment when they move from the legal market to the illegal market. We can figure that out. And that would be one of the ways that we would want to answer that question about the distribution of guns. Listen, a lot of guns are used in murder, a lot of guns in street crimes, a lot of guns of the kind of character context, dispute stuff that I mentioned early on. Those are legal guns. Kids take the guns out of their families' homes. They can buy a gun off a gun dealer who bought the gun legally. Mm. And so the gun looks like it's legal, but it turns out it's not legally owned by the minor or the young person who possesses it. So the answer is up to a point we can trace what happens to a gun when it converts from legal to illegal. And then we can make that decision about guns used in homicides or injury violence in legal context and non-legal context. One thing I think it's important to mention about data, we have excellent data nationally through the Vital Stats program in HHS, National Center for Health Statistics, about firearm deaths, intentional injuries for firearms. We also know about accidental deaths with firearms. What we know much less about are shooting victims who don't die. That depends on local police departments to collect that data. It depends on whether or not the person shows up in an emergency room, emergency department to get care, or possibly somebody reports it. But there's nothing like the fatality system that's in place for the non-fatal gun violence data. And that's something that we need to sharpen up, because our understanding of the totality of gun violence is really pretty limited, or it's limited in important ways. We know about the most serious forms of violence, the ones that produce deaths. We know something about the ones that lead to hospitalizations, but we don't know about the everyday violence. Some police departments collect that data, some don't. I think that's a really important piece of data that we don't have in our data arsenal to come up with sound policies, especially when there are going to be challenges to restrictions of the firearm access.
Well, we started with about 13 questions and we've gone through over 10 and we still have 15 left. So you've sparked a lot of discussion from our audience members.
I'm happy to go. So you want to go to late? I can go to 8. That's fine.
Okay, I will see what Kempe says. He's the boss here.
Okay.
He wants to let me know. But we had a lot of questions. I think people just feel really kind of overwhelmed with, they just don't understand. You know, they say, sometimes these people say the Second Amendment and they mean the original, but not the original, where, you know, automatic weapons are very different from something in the time that could shoot 6 times a minute or something. And so what
let me answer that, because it's a really critical point. One of the points in the Bruin decision, and one of the points in the Dobbs decision about reproductive rights, and the decision about the administrative state, the regulation of environmental laws, probably something that's going to come down the pike on election laws, is that the deciding factor is not what the changes that have happened in the modern eras. Modernity could be anywhere from the Civil War forward. It's what was in place at the moment of the founding. This is what originalism means in the interpretation of statute, the interpretation of the canon. The law starts, and in many instances ends with what we can discern, what was history and tradition at the moment when the right was granted in the Constitution. And that's a radical departure. Because, for example, just take the question you raised, the difference between a musket and an automatic weapon. Mm-hmm. In some renderings of the Bruin decision, it makes no difference whatsoever. Mm-hmm. So now there's much more to say about that, but that's really the core of the question about what matters in terms of forming a constitutional precedent. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm trying to get through some of these other questions here. I guess let's talk a little bit in the last few minutes about the pandemic. You had a chart that showed there was a low point for homicide kind of before the pandemic, and then it went up. But David says there were a low point actually in 2018 and 2019 that was lower than 2020. So he says the starting point before the pandemic.
That's right. It was lower between roughly 2010 and 2016. It was down, There was a little bit of a bump up from 2016 after the Ferguson uprising for a couple of years, and then in 18 and 19 it dipped down again, and then it shot up in 20. So there were these events like Columbine, like Las Vegas, all of these events that actually created a demand for guns. So I think if I understood what the question was, I think that they're right. It did dip down in 18 and 19 before shooting up again in 20.
So one more question about data. Somebody says that a lot of people blame our AR-15s. It's the best-selling model of the rifle in the US right now. And they ask if you statistically compensate for the prejudice that introduces to the data. So if half the rifles in circulation were AR-15s and 45% of the mass shooters use them, they say this would suggest that owners of the AR-15s are in fact less likely than owners of other rifles to use them to commit a mass shooting. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
Well, that's a statistical conclusion. Let me say this. Yeah, bias is a problem when researchers do their studies. They're not unlike any other humans. But what we do count on is a very deep reservoir of the rules of science and the rules of causal reasoning. More often than not, even with some of its flaws, we rely on the peer review system to point out flaws in particular studies that make certain claims. We rely on readers and commentators of those studies to point out when somebody is overclaiming about a finding. It could be a small finding and they make a big deal out of it. But that's an overclaiming problem, and we call them out when they overclaim. So I think it's in, I think we have to have a little faith in science and in the way science is done to root out when bias happens. And believe me, I know all about bias in science. I edited a peer-reviewed journal for about 7 years. I knew who was going to react to a particular submission in what way. And I would rule them, depending on the subject. So I'd rule them out and I would send it to a person who's neutral. So this, it's a very good question because it's an important point that we have to have some watchdogs in science. And we do. We have the National Academy of Sciences, we have the National Research Council, we have the Institute of Medicine, National Science Foundation. We have a lot of places that are watchdogs on bad science. And just to reinforce that, I personally have signed on to a letter in the last 3 days demanding that a really bad paper be retracted from a journal. It's a paper that makes a claim that progressive prosecutors have increased the homicide rate by not being aggressive in their prosecutions. It's a scurrilous claim, and it's not backed up by the data. So this is part of the social world of peer review and scientific thinking and analysis.
Well, we did not get to all of our questions, as I'm sure everybody can tell, but if you feel comfortable and want to give us your contact info, or maybe just let us know kind of where they can go to read more about any of these issues, we can share information in our email tomorrow. But if you have any closing thoughts in the last couple of minutes, we do always love our guests to just tell people where to go to keep getting smart on this issue.
Well, my coordinates are on the Columbia Law School website, so you can find me there. Email, phone number, although I'm not in the office, I'm away during the pandemic, but I do read my email. Closing thoughts. I think that we really are at the dawn of an era that we're looking into a space and we have no idea what's in that space. And the space is the world of deregulated firearm carrying without a license. And that's really to me, the most, as a researcher, it's fantastic. We get to study things that we've never studied before. As a citizen of the country, it scares me that there's going to be an uptick in homicide. We already have enough homicide problems. And I didn't really talk much about racial equity and racial fairness. I think that maybe we don't really know how that's going to shake out. Right now, the burden of firearm homicides and firearm violence falls on minority folks. If there's too many guns available, it's minority folks who suffer, whether or not they're participants in the violence. So I think we're going to see possibly the Bruin opinion and the open carry legislation and the open carry laws and the taking down of the restrictions on licensing procedures. I think that's going to create some risks, serious risks. That's my closing thought. I wish I could say, hey, it's all going to be better, everybody. It's going to be better until the next time that we hear about a mass shooting.
Well, thank you so much for your time tonight. We had a big audience and we always get interest after the fact. So again, thank you for being here with us tonight. We did record the event and I will be sharing the link tomorrow.
Okay.
We'll see if we can find your information to include in that. But thank you everyone for attending and we hope that you have a great night.